Behind the biblical grandeur and Gregory Peck's commanding performance lies a treasure trove of Hollywood oddities. From a professional wrestler turned biblical giant to a political campaign ad that changed history, and a silent film legend's surprise comeback. This 1951 epic harbored secrets that would make even King David blush. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about David and Bathsheba. Fact 1. Goliath was a wrestling legend. When audiences watched David and Bathsheba in 1951, they witnessed one of the most memorable David versus Goliath scenes ever filmed, but few realized that the towering giant, threatening to crush Gregory Peck's heroic king, was actually a professional wrestler from Lithuania, who had made his name grappling in American rings under a completely different identity. Walter Talloon stood an imposing 6 feet 8 inches tall, making him perfect for the role of the biblical giant Goliath of Gath, but his path to Hollywood came through the world of professional wrestling rather than traditional acting. Before stepping onto the movie set in Nogales, Arizona, Talloon had built his reputation as a crowd-pleasing performer in wrestling arenas across America, where fans knew him by his ring name, the Polish Angel. This theatrical persona was quite a contrast to the menacing Philistine warrior he would portray on screen. The casting choice reflected Hollywood's practical approach to finding actors who could convincingly play larger-than-life biblical characters without relying entirely on camera tricks or special effects. Talon's wrestling background actually served him well in the role, since professional wrestlers were already accustomed to playing exaggerated characters and performing physical stunts in front of audiences. His experience with theatrical combat and dramatic posturing translated naturally to portraying the intimidating giant who terrorized the Israelite army. What makes this casting even more interesting is that Talloon's wrestling career had prepared him for exactly the kind of physical performance the role demanded. Professional wrestlers in the 1940s and 50s were skilled at projecting menace and power through their body language and movements, skills that proved invaluable when bringing the biblical giant to life. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary audiences who recognized that this fearsome biblical villain was actually an entertainer who usually played the heroic good guy in wrestling matches, complete with an angelic nickname that couldn't have been more different from his on-screen character. Fact 2. Gregory Peck's near-fatal heart scare. During the production of David and Bathsheba, Gregory Peck experienced a terrifying medical emergency that brought filming to a sudden halt when the beloved actor was rushed to the hospital with symptoms that doctors initially feared indicated a serious heart attack. The incident occurred while Peck was working on this demanding biblical epic in 1951, at a time when the actor was at the height of his career, but also pushing himself to dangerous limits both professionally and personally. Peck had been maintaining an exhausting schedule of back-to-back film projects, and the physical and emotional demands of playing the complex King David were taking their toll on the 35-year-old star who was already dealing with significant personal struggles. What made this health scare particularly alarming was that Peck had already been hospitalized 2 years earlier in 1949 with heart spasms, which should have served as a warning about his lifestyle choices. During the David and Bathsheba production, when he suddenly experienced chest pains and other symptoms that mimicked a heart attack, the medical team and film crew feared the worst, especially given his previous cardiac issues. However, after thorough examination and testing, doctors determined that Peck's latest episode was actually caused by heart palpitations brought on by a dangerous combination of heavy alcohol consumption and severe overwork rather than an actual heart attack. This revelation shed light on the intense pressure that major Hollywood stars faced during the studio system era, where actors were expected to maintain grueling schedules while dealing with personal demons largely on their own. The health scare served as a wake-up call for Peck, who began drinking less after this incident, though he continued smoking for many years afterward. The episode also highlighted how the demanding nature of epic film productions could push even the most professional actors to their breaking points, with Peck's dedication to his craft nearly costing him his health during what would become one of his most memorable biblical performances. Fact 3. Susan Hayward's bizarre prop purchase. Years after David and Bathsheba wrapped production, Susan Hayward made one of the most unusual purchases in Hollywood history when she acquired the actual full-scale Ark of the Covenant prop that had been used in the film, buying it directly from a 20th Century Fox studio auction. The Ark prop itself was no ordinary movie set piece, having been meticulously crafted from oiled acacia wood to create an authentic-looking replica of the biblical artifact that plays a central role in the film's dramatic climax. In the movie, The Ark serves as both a powerful religious symbol and a plot device, with characters who touch it meeting sudden death, making it one of the most memorable and important props in the entire production. What makes Hayward's purchase particularly fascinating is that the Ark wasn't just a decorative background piece, but a fully functional prop that had been designed and built to withstand the demands of major Hollywood filmmaking. The studio's prop department had invested considerable time and resources into creating something that would look convincing on camera, while also being durable enough for multiple takes and the physical demands of the production process. Studio auctions were common practice in Hollywood's golden age, as major film companies would periodically sell off costumes, props, and set pieces to make room in their warehouses and generate additional revenue from completed productions. These auctions often attracted collectors, fans, and sometimes the actors themselves who wanted to own a piece of film history from projects that had been meaningful to them. For Hayward, purchasing the Ark represented more than just acquiring a movie souvenir, since David and Bathsheba had been one of her most significant biblical epic roles, pairing her with Gregory Peck in a film that became a major box office success. The fact that she chose to buy this particular prop suggests it held special significance for her, whether as a memento of the production experience or simply as an impressive conversation piece for her home. Fact 4. The Star of David anachronism. Throughout David and Bathsheba, Gregory Peck prominently wears the Star of David symbol as part of his royal costume, but this created a major historical anachronism since the six-pointed star wouldn't actually appear as a Jewish symbol for many centuries after the biblical King David's reign. The real King David ruled Israel around 1000 to 960 BCE, during a time when the Star of David symbol simply didn't exist in Jewish culture or religious practice. Historical evidence shows that this distinctive six-pointed star, also known as the Shield of David or Magen David in Hebrew, first appeared as a decorative element much later, around the 3rd century CE, and even then it wasn't specifically associated with Jewish identity or religious significance. The symbol didn't become commonly recognized as a Jewish emblem until the medieval period, when it began appearing on synagogues and Jewish manuscripts, and it only became widely adopted as a symbol of Jewish identity during the 19th and 20th centuries. This means that Gregory Peck's character was wearing a symbol that wouldn't be invented for over 1,000 years after the historical David's death, making it roughly equivalent to depicting a Roman centurion wearing a modern wristwatch. This type of historical oversight was actually quite common in Hollywood biblical epics of the 1950s, when filmmakers prioritized visual storytelling and audience recognition over strict historical accuracy. The costume designers likely chose the Star of David because modern audiences would immediately understand it as a symbol representing Jewish identity and kingship, even though it was completely out of place for the time period being depicted. The anachronism reflects the broader challenge that Hollywood faced when adapting ancient stories for contemporary audiences, often having to balance historical authenticity with the need to communicate ideas quickly and clearly through visual symbols that viewers would recognize. While historians and biblical scholars would certainly notice this error, the most moviegoers in 1951 would have accepted the Star of David as an appropriate symbol for the Jewish king without questioning its historical accuracy. Fact 5. Singapore's religious censorship. When David and Bathsheba was released worldwide in 1951, Singapore's censorship board made the dramatic decision to ban the film entirely from their country, citing serious concerns about how the movie portrayed King David as a hedonistic ruler driven by sexual desire rather than spiritual devotion. The censors' objection stemmed from the fact that David, known in Arabic as Dawood, holds an important position as a prophet in Islamic tradition, where he is revered not only as a king but as a righteous messenger of God who received divine revelations. In Islamic teaching, prophets are considered to be protected from major sins and moral failings, making the film's depiction of David as someone who commits adultery, murder, and other serious transgressions deeply problematic for Muslim audiences. Singapore's censorship board was particularly troubled by the movie's focus on David's affair with Bathsheba and his subsequent actions to cover up their relationship, including arranging for her husband's death in battle. These elements of the story, while based on biblical accounts, presented David in a way that directly contradicted Islamic beliefs about the moral character and behavior expected of prophets, who are supposed to serve as perfect examples of righteousness for humanity to follow. The ban reflected broader tensions that often arose when Hollywood biblical epics were distributed in countries with significant Muslim populations, where religious sensitivities about the portrayal of shared religious figures could create unexpected diplomatic and cultural challenges. What made this situation particularly interesting was that the same story elements that made the film acceptable to Christian audiences, who are more comfortable with the idea that biblical figures could be flawed and sinful, made it completely unacceptable to Muslim viewers. This censorship decision highlighted how the same religious story could be interpreted very differently across various faith traditions, with Singapore's action serving as an early example of how global film distribution would increasingly need to navigate complex religious and cultural sensitivities when dealing with stories that touched on shared religious heritage. Fact 6. The famous political ad connection. David and Bathsheba became an unexpected part of American political history when President Lyndon Johnson's legendary Daisy Girl campaign advertisement aired for the first and only time during NBC's Monday Night at the movie's broadcast of the film on September 7, 1964. The commercial itself was a groundbreaking 60-second spot that featured a young girl picking petals from a daisy while counting, before transitioning into a nuclear countdown and mushroom cloud explosion, with Johnson's voice warning that voters must choose between love and destruction. This advertisement is widely considered the most famous and controversial political attack ad in American history, fundamentally changing how campaigns would use television to influence voters for decades to come. What made the timing particularly significant was that an estimated 50 million Americans were watching David and Bathsheba that evening, giving the Johnson campaign access to one of the largest television audiences of the year during prime viewing hours. The ad never actually mentioned Johnson's Republican opponent Barry Goldwater by name, but it was clearly designed to paint him as a dangerous warmonger who might lead the country into nuclear war, playing on existing fears about his hawkish positions on military action. The advertisement was so powerful and generated such immediate controversy that the Johnson campaign pulled it after this single airing, but the damage to Goldwater's campaign was already done. Major television networks then featured the ad in their news coverage throughout the following week, meaning that millions of additional viewers saw it again without the campaign having to pay for more airtime. The choice to place this historic political advertisement during a biblical epic about sin, redemption, and divine judgment created an oddly appropriate backdrop for what would become a defining moment in American political advertising. The fact that audiences were watching a story about the consequences of poor leadership decisions while being presented with their own crucial political choice added an unintentional layer of meaning to both the film and the advertisement. Fact 7. Silent film legend's comeback. The actor who played King Saul in David and Bathsheba was Francis X. Bushman, a legendary silent film star who had once been advertised as the handsomest man in the world and had appeared in the original 1925 version of Ben-Hur, making his casting a remarkable example of Hollywood history coming full circle. During the silent film era of the 1910s and 20s, Bushman had been one of the biggest movie stars in the world, commanding enormous salaries and living in appropriately grand style with a 280-acre estate and a fleet of lavender limousines. His popularity was so intense that studios initially kept his marriage secret to maintain his image as an available romantic idol, and songs and poems were written in his honor by adoring fans who considered him the epitome of masculine beauty and charm. Bushman's most famous silent film role had been playing Messala, the villainous Roman tribune in the original Ben-Hur epic, where he starred opposite Ramon Navarro, in what was then one of the most expensive productions in film history. That movie had been a massive spectacle featuring real chariot races and elaborate sets, establishing Bushman as a major star in biblical and historical epics long before talkies even existed. By 1951, when David and Bathsheba was being filmed, Bushman was 68 years old and had successfully transitioned from silent films to talkies, though his roles had become much smaller than his leading man days. His appearance as King Saul represented a poignant return to biblical filmmaking, allowing him to once again appear in the type of grand religious epic that had helped make him famous decades earlier. What made this casting particularly touching was that Bushman was still generating enthusiastic fan reactions during promotional tours for David and Bathsheba, proving that his legendary status from the silent era continued to resonate with audiences who remembered his glory days as one of cinema's first major heartthrobs and international stars. Fact 8. Arizona masquerading as Israel. The entire production of David and Bathsheba took place in the desert landscape of Nogales, Arizona, where 20th Century Fox constructed an elaborate biblical city set that the studio playfully but officially named David and Bathsheba, AZ, on their production paperwork and publicity materials. This Arizona location was actually a backup plan rather than the filmmaker's first choice, since the original intention had been to shoot the movie in the actual Holy Land, using what the industry called frozen funds, which were foreign earnings that American studios couldn't bring back to the United States due to international financial regulations. Filming in the Middle East would have provided authentic backgrounds and allowed the studio to use money that was already sitting overseas. However, world events forced a dramatic change in these ambitious location plans when the Korean War broke out and the United States deployed a significant portion of its naval fleet to the Mediterranean region. The increased military presence and political tensions in the Middle East made it too risky and complicated for a major Hollywood production to operate in that region, forcing the filmmakers to find an alternative location that could convincingly double for ancient Israel. The choice of Nogales, which sits right on the border between Arizona and Mexico, proved to be surprisingly effective since the desert terrain and stark landscape provided a convincing backdrop for the biblical story. The production team built extensive sets from November 24, 1950, until January of 1951, with some additional material shot in February, creating a complete ancient city that could accommodate all the film's dramatic requirements. The decision to officially designate their constructed town as David and Bathsheba, AZ reflected Hollywood's sense of humor about the situation, while also serving practical purposes for legal and administrative documentation. This meant that for several months, there was actually a place called David and Bathsheba, Arizona, even if it existed only on movie studio maps and production schedules. Fact 9. Gwen Verdon's uncredited dance debut. One of the most intriguing uncredited performances in David and Bathsheba came from a young red-headed dancer named Gwen Verdon, who would later become one of Broadway's biggest musical theater legends, but at the time was just another Hollywood specialty dancer trying to make her mark in the film industry. Verdon's scene in the movie featured her performing a seductive dance that was specifically designed to tempt King David's soldiers, including Bathsheba's husband Uriah, as part of the film's exploration of desire and temptation themes. The choreography was created by Jack Cole, who was already a legendary figure in Hollywood dance, and had been working with Verdon as both his assistant choreographer and principal dancer since the late 1940s. What makes this performance particularly significant is that it represented one of Verdon's earliest film appearances during a period when she was still largely unknown to mainstream audiences, working mostly as an uncredited specialty dancer in various Hollywood productions. At this point in her career, she was primarily known for coaching established stars on how to move and dance rather than for her own performances, making her work in David and Bathsheba an important stepping stone toward her eventual Broadway stardom. The fact that Verdon received no screen credit for her memorable dance scene was unfortunately typical of how Hollywood treated specialty dancers during this era, when even talented performers were often considered interchangeable background elements rather than artists worthy of recognition. This lack of credit meant that most audiences had no idea they were watching a future four-time Tony Award winner who would go on to create iconic roles in shows like Can Can, Damn Yankees, and Chicago. Jack Cole's choreography for Verdon's scene incorporated his signature style of jazz-influenced movement that would later become a major influence on Broadway choreography, making this uncredited appearance an early example of the artistic collaboration that was helping to shape American dance in both film and theater during the 1950s. Fact 10. The original 4-hour epic plan. Screenwriter Philip Dunn's original vision for David and Bathsheba was far more ambitious than the film that eventually reached theaters, as he initially conceived the project as a massive 4-hour epic that would chronicle King David's entire life story from his youth as a shepherd boy, all the way through his final years as an aging monarch. Dunn's comprehensive treatment was structured around 3 distinct chapters that would have covered the major phases of David's biblical story, beginning with his famous childhood victory over the giant Goliath and his early days serving in King Saul's court. The second chapter would have focused on David's friendship with Jonathan, Saul's son, and would have culminated with the affair with Bathsheba that forms the central plot of the finished film. The final section was planned to explore David's relationship with his rebellious son Absalom and the family conflicts that marked his later reign. When Dunn presented this expansive concept to producer Daryl Zanuck, he estimated that the full treatment would require approximately 4 hours of screen time to properly develop all the characters and storylines he wanted to include. This would have made it one of the longest films ever produced by a major Hollywood studio, requiring either an intermission structure similar to theatrical presentations or release as multiple separate films. However, Zanuck was not enthusiastic about committing to such an enormous and expensive undertaking, especially given the practical challenges of marketing and distributing a 4-hour biblical epic to mainstream audiences. Instead of approving the full scope of Dunn's vision, Zanuck asked the screenwriter to focus exclusively on the David and Bathsheba relationship, which became the concentrated dramatic core of the final screenplay. This decision to narrow the focus actually strengthened the finished film by allowing Dunn to explore the themes of power, corruption, and redemption in much greater depth than would have been possible in a broader biographical epic that tried to cover David's entire life story. Fact 11. Peck's biblical face casting. Producer Darryl Zanuck's decision to cast Gregory Peck as King David came down to a surprisingly simple and visual reason. Zanuck believed that Peck possessed what he called a biblical face that would make him the perfect choice to portray the legendary Israelite monarch on screen. This casting philosophy reflected the Hollywood studio system's approach to biblical epics during the 1950s, when producers were looking for actors who could embody the gravitas and moral authority that audiences expected from famous religious figures. Zanuck felt that Peck's strong jawline, penetrating eyes, and naturally serious demeanor gave him an appearance that would convince moviegoers they were watching an authentic biblical king rather than just another Hollywood leading man in costume. The concept of having a biblical face wasn't just about physical attractiveness, but rather about projecting the kind of wisdom, strength, and spiritual depth that audiences associated with Old Testament heroes and prophets. Peck's previous roles had already established him as an actor who could convincingly portray characters with strong moral convictions and leadership qualities, making him seem like a natural fit for the complex role of David. What made this casting choice particularly smart was that Peck was coming off one of his most acclaimed performances as General Frank Savage in the war film 12 O'Clock High, where he had demonstrated his ability to play a leader struggling with the burden of command and the moral complexities of making life and death decisions. These themes would prove essential to his portrayal of King David, who faces similar challenges when his personal desires conflict with his responsibilities as both a ruler and a servant of God. Zanuck's instinct about Peck's biblical face proved to be correct, as the actor's performance became one of the most memorable aspects of the film, helping to establish him as one of Hollywood's go-to choices for roles requiring both physical presence and moral authority. Fact 12. The top box office hit. David and Bathsheba became the biggest box office sensation of 1951, surprising many industry observers by out-earning some of the year's most celebrated and popular films, including classics like The African Queen starring Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn, and the acclaimed musical An American in Paris featuring Gene Kelly. The film's commercial success was particularly remarkable given that biblical epics were often considered risky investments by Hollywood studios, since religious subject matter could be challenging to market to mainstream audiences who might expect either overly preachy content or spectacular action sequences. However, David and Bathsheba managed to strike the perfect balance between spiritual themes and compelling human drama, creating a story that appealed to both religious moviegoers and general audiences looking for sophisticated entertainment. According to industry records, the film earned $4.72 million in theater rentals from the United States and Canada alone, which represented an enormous success for 20th Century Fox and validated producer Darryl Zanuck's decision to invest in this particular biblical story. These impressive earnings also demonstrated that audiences were hungry for well-crafted historical dramas that treated religious subjects with respect while still delivering the kind of emotional intensity and star power that made satisfying movie experiences. The box office triumph was especially significant because it proved that biblical films could compete successfully against other popular genres of the early 1950s, including war movies, musicals, and romantic comedies. This success helped pave the way for the biblical epic boom that would continue throughout the decade, inspiring other studios to develop their own religious spectacles, featuring major stars and lavish production values. The film's financial performance also reflected the drawing power of Gregory Peck and Susan Hayward, whose star appeal combined with the inherent drama of the David and Bathsheba story to create a commercial formula that resonated with moviegoers across the country during a particularly competitive year for Hollywood releases. Fact 13. The anti-McCarthyism allegory. Years after David and Bathsheba was released, Gregory Peck revealed that the film contained a hidden political message, explaining that the movie had been deliberately written as a subtle attack on McCarthyism, the anti-communist crusade led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, that was sweeping through American politics and Hollywood during the early 1950s. Peck, who was a vocal opponent of McCarthy's tactics and the blacklisting of suspected communist sympathizers in the entertainment industry, saw the biblical story of King David as the perfect vehicle for exploring themes about the corruption that comes with absolute power and the dangers of leaders who abuse their authority. The parallels between David's misuse of his royal power to satisfy his personal desires and McCarthy's use of his political influence to destroy careers and reputations would have been apparent to audiences who understood the contemporary political context. The timing of the film's production made this political allegory particularly relevant, since McCarthyism was at its peak during 1950 and 1951, when David and Bathsheba was being written and filmed. Hollywood was already feeling the impact of McCarthy's investigations, with many writers, directors, and actors being blacklisted or forced to work under assumed names, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion throughout the film industry. Screenwriter Philip Dunn had conceived the story as what he called a modern play, exploring the corruption of absolute power, which fit perfectly with Peck's desire to use the biblical narrative as a commentary on contemporary political issues. The film's focus on how David's abuse of power leads to personal tragedy and national suffering served as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority, whether wielded by ancient kings or modern politicians. This political subtext was carefully hidden beneath the surface of the biblical story, allowing the filmmakers to make their point about McCarthyism without directly confronting the political establishment or risking their own careers during a particularly dangerous time for Hollywood liberals. Fact 14. Korean War changed filming location. The Korean War unexpectedly changed the entire filming strategy for David and Bathsheba, forcing 20th Century Fox to abandon their original plan to shoot the biblical epic in the actual Holy Land, and instead relocate the entire production to the Arizona desert due to military and political complications in the Mediterranean region. The studio's initial intention had been to film on location in the Middle East using what Hollywood called frozen funds, which were foreign earnings that American movie companies had accumulated overseas but couldn't bring back to the United States because of international currency restrictions and financial regulations. Shooting in the Holy Land would have allowed Fox to use this trapped money while also providing authentic biblical locations that would have given the film unprecedented realism and geographical accuracy. However, when the Korean War began in June of 1950 and escalated throughout the summer and fall, and the United States military responded by deploying a significant portion of the Navy's fleet to the Mediterranean Sea as part of a broader strategy to contain communist expansion and protect American interests in the region. This massive military presence created logistical nightmares for civilian operations in the area, making it extremely difficult and potentially dangerous for a major Hollywood production to operate in the Middle East. The increased military activity, combined with rising political tensions throughout the region as the Cold War intensified, meant that bringing a large film crew, expensive equipment, and major movie stars to shoot in the Holy Land had become too risky and complicated for the studio to manage safely. The production would have required extensive coordination with military authorities and faced potential disruptions from ongoing geopolitical events that were completely beyond the filmmakers' control. Faced with these insurmountable obstacles, Fox made the practical decision to move the entire production to Nogales, Arizona, where they could create convincing biblical landscapes without dealing with international complications, military interference, or the unpredictable political situation that was developing in the Middle East during this crucial period of the Cold War. Fact 15. The suicide scene. That wasn't. The climactic scene of David and Bathsheba features one of the most dramatically intense moments in biblical filmmaking, where King David deliberately touches the sacred Ark of the Covenant in what was scripted as a suicide attempt, only to experience divine mercy instead of the instant death that had befallen other characters who accidentally contacted the holy relic. Throughout the film, the Ark of the Covenant had been established as a deadly religious artifact that kills anyone who touches it, as demonstrated earlier when a soldier named Uzzah dies immediately after reaching out to steady the Ark when it nearly falls from a cart. This setup created tremendous dramatic tension for the final scene, where audiences understood that David's decision to place his hands on the Ark represented his willingness to accept death as punishment for his sins of adultery and murder. David's action was portrayed as a desperate act of repentance and self-sacrifice, where the guilt-ridden king enters the Holy of Holies, seeking relief from the drought that has plagued Israel, and hoping to save his people by offering his own life in exchange for divine forgiveness. The scene was designed to show David taking full responsibility for his actions and demonstrating his willingness to pay the ultimate price for his moral failures. However, instead of the expected fatal consequences, David's touch triggers a completely different response from the divine realm, as thunder crashes and he experiences a series of flashbacks to his youth, including scenes of his anointing by the prophet Samuel and his famous victory over Goliath. These visions serve as reminders of his earlier righteousness and his special relationship with God, suggesting that divine mercy has overruled divine justice. The scene concludes with David removing his hands from the ark unharmed, followed immediately by the arrival of life-giving rain that ends the drought and signals God's forgiveness for both David and the nation of Israel, transforming what began as a suicide attempt into a moment of spiritual redemption and renewal.